Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching Kolchak and Russia's Civil War by Epic History. Now, this is a little mini-series that I missed when it came out, and so now we're finally getting to it. As you guys know, I always love Epic History's videos, and I think the Russian Civil War is a fascinating topic. At this point, we've done a good deal of videos on the USSR and on this era of Russian history, so I'm very excited to jump into it. I'm going to be reacting to this in two different parts, since that's how Epic History released this one. If you guys end up enjoying this series, I'd appreciate it if you'd leave a like, subscribe to my channel, and check out my Patreon, which is linked down below. Now, with all of that out of the way, let's jump right into this reaction.
November 1918. In Western Europe, the 4-year slaughter of World War I is drawing to an end. But across the former Russian Empire, a new conflict has broken out. A civil war that rages from Central Europe to the Pacific.
Yeah, that's right. Russia wasn't quite done, right? Europe has been through years of this extraordinarily destructive war, and Russia has left the war due to the revolution, and now has launched itself into another extremely brutal conflict, the Russian Civil War.
And will claim an estimated 9 million lives.
Jesus.
Lenin, the Bolsheviks, and their new Soviet Republic battle for survival against their many enemies, collectively known as the Whites.
Yeah, I mean, we'll be talking about Kolchak in these two episodes. The whole series is ostensibly about him. Now, he's not nearly as well known as Lenin, I think, for a couple of reasons. One is that, of course, the Bolsheviks, they win this war. They go on to, rule over Russia and, the Russian Empire, the Soviet Union, which they begin to build their empire, really from this point onwards. Kolchak is the leader of the Whites, though it was not always, in fact, it was almost never a very unified force. It was pretty split. There were a lot of different factions. As you could imagine, it was just really sort of anybody who opposed the Bolsheviks, which was a lot of different groups of people. So, they were not as singularly oriented as the Bolsheviks were. And of course, in the end, the Whites lose this war.
The Whites' great hope, their newly appointed supreme ruler of Russia, Admiral Alexander Kolchak. He is a war hero, a man of duty and discipline, who believes above all in service to the motherland. Millions look to him to crush the Bolsheviks, avenge the murdered Tsar, and save Russia from chaos and collapse. This is the extraordinary tale of the life and death of Admiral Kolchak, Russia's only supreme ruler.
It's an interesting way to tell the story of the Civil War by looking at the life of Kolchak here. It's taking a bit of a different angle than you might usually.
The Arctic Ocean, 1900. Russian scientific vessel Zarya sails east on a voyage of discovery to the outer fringes of the Russian Empire. The expedition leader is Baron Edward von Toll, a renowned Russian explorer and geologist. He intends to explore the Arctic Ocean and discover Sannikov Land, a near-mythical landmass rumored to lie north of the Novosibirsk Islands. Among his crew, 26-year-old Naval Lieutenant Alexander Vasilievich Kolchak. Kolchak had been a brilliant naval cadet, but service aboard the Petropavlovsk, one of Russia's newest battleships, had bored him. Kolchak had a passion for scientific discovery and oceanography.
Interesting. It's a curious direction to take one's career. I find myself wondering, and I'm sure we're going to find out, if he had any involvement in the Russo-Japanese War. You'd imagine, a Navy man, yes, but I don't know much about Kolchak, aside from his involvement and leadership in the Russian Civil War. The rest of his life, I can't say I know really anything about the guy.
And a thirst for adventure. When Baron Toll asked him to join his expedition, he leapt at the chance. The dawn of the 20th century is an age of intense imperial rivalry and scientific exploration. Russia, under the autocratic reign of Tsar Nicholas II, seeks to modernize and learn more about its vast eastern territories. Toll's expedition is part of this process, and proves as dramatic as any tale in the annals of polar exploration. Toll was a deeply ambitious leader and expert geologist, but knew little about the sea. His ship, Zarya, was in poor condition and ill-suited for long voyages in the ice. Nevertheless, the expedition spent 2 years exploring the frozen coast, ice floes, and islands of Russia's Arctic north. On one occasion, Toll was nearly drowned by a walrus.
What
Kolchak
the hell?
was pursued by polar bears.
Oh my god.
In May 1902, frustrated by his failure to find Sannikov Land, Toll took an extremely dangerous decision. With Zarya trapped in sea ice, he set off with 3 men traveling by sled to reach Bennett Island.
Okay.
Zarya broke free of the ice a month later and set off to collect him. But facing impenetrable ice and running out of coal, Zarya had to turn back. Toll and his team were stranded.
I mean, before this story's even over, what a crazy way to start. Obviously, it's not like we started with Kolchak's birth. He's already into his career at this point. What a crazy first chapter of the video.
Lieutenant Kolchak had distinguished himself as a key member of the expedition and a loyal comrade to Baron Toll. He was determined their leader should not be abandoned. Returning 3,500 miles overland to St. Petersburg, Kolchak helped to organize a rescue mission.
Jesus.
His plan seemed insane. To reach Bennett Island without a ship, using only sleds and small boats. But in the absence of better options, his proposal was approved.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like, frankly, they don't, or didn't quite have the equipment necessary for these conditions. Now, I mean, few people did. This is an era where this type of exploration was extremely dangerous, as evidenced by this whole journey. We'll see if they're able to successfully carry out this rescue mission. But yeah, with the equipment, material they have, we'll see if they can make it work.
Kolchak postponed his own wedding to return to the Arctic and begin preparations. On the 5th of May 1903, Kolchak's 17-man rescue expedition set off across 600 miles of snow and dangerous, shifting pack ice. Traveling by a combination of dog sled and whaleboat, it took 3 grueling months to reach Bennett Island, where they found no sign of Baron Toll.
Uh-oh.
Just an abandoned campsite, some scientific observations, and a note.
Before we get to the note, I'm so curious to hear what it says, but it's been a long time, you know what I mean? I feel like a lot of things could have gone wrong, happened.
Departing south today, it read. We have provisions for 14 to 20 days. All are in good health. The note was dated the 26th of October. It was 9 months old.
Yeah.
No sign of Tall or...
They were way, way too late. Unfortunately, not too surprising.
his 3 companions was ever found.
Yeah, and that was the fate of a lot of these explorers. You know, we tend to hear about the more glorious stories, but like I said, this was an extremely dangerous mission to undertake, and a lot of people simply did not make it back. So yeah, what a crazy first real chapter in Kolchak's career and story.
Despite its failure, Kolchak's daring rescue mission won him national fame and the Imperial Geographical Society's highest award, the Constantine Medal. It also won him a nickname, Kolchak Poliarny, Polar Kolchak.
Ha! Nice.
Returning to Yakutsk in January 1904, Kolchak learned that Japan had attacked Russia's Far Eastern base at Port Arthur, and war had been declared.
So here we go.
Here was an opportunity for action, and the service to the motherland that Kolchak craved. He immediately requested a transfer to the front.
Yeah, and this Russo-Japanese War is really a precursor for a lot of things, right? It's a good example of modern naval warfare, right? That a lot of observers were paying close attention to. Of course, people didn't know that, you know, a global war was not but 10 years away, but this was definitely a sign of where technology was at. It was a precursor, or not really a precursor, but just an example of Japan's expanding empire and influence. Of course, the Japanese would continue to expand throughout Asia, growing more and more powerful. And of course, this leads to the 1905 revolution in Russia, which, you know, they're going to have another revolution, the one that is most relevant to Kolchak, a little more than 10 years after this one here. So once again, a lot of sort of things to look at here for those interested in the next 10 to 20 years of history. You can really learn a lot from the Russo-Japanese War.
But first, he met his fiancée, Sofia Fyodorovna, in Irkutsk for their postponed wedding. 4 days later, he left for the Far East. The world expected Russia, a great imperial power, to easily defeat Japan, an Asiatic upstart, according to racial views of the time.
Yeah, I mean, there was, you know, both the sort of established understanding of the imperial order, that Russia was this grand empire, and Japan was not. And then that was very much tied up with the racism of the time, that Russia is this great European nation, yeah, even though Russia spreads across Eurasia, right? Deep into Asia, in fact. Japan is this, like they said, an upstart Asian power. There's no way they could possibly rival the power of Russia. And so, of course, a lot of people were surprised, including the Russians.
But instead, the war proved a frustrating and humiliating experience for Russia's military.
Yeah.
With devastating defeats on land and sea, leading to a political crisis at home.
Especially at sea. It was extremely humiliating for Russia. I don't know how involved Kolchak was and how he carried himself. Maybe he individually performed well. Maybe we'll learn that. Generally, not a lot of glory to be won in this war, because it went so badly for Russia, and people became so frustrated by their performance in the war. And of course, that was a big part of what led to that 1905 uprising in Russia.
There was little Lieutenant Kolchak could do to change the tide of war.
Yeah.
Bottled up with Russia's Pacific Fleet in Port Arthur. He nevertheless served with distinction and courage.
Okay.
As commander of a small, aging destroyer, his main role was laying mines at sea. In December 1904, one of his mines scored a major success, sinking the Japanese cruiser Takasago. But the repetitive nature of his duties bored Kolchak, and he was dogged by ill health.
Seems like a man who is easily brought to boredom. We've heard that twice now about this man, who is relatively early in his career. So it seems like maybe someone who's looking for action and excitement. Perhaps ambitious? We haven't quite gotten a read of his character yet, but definitely someone who gets bored by the sort of repetition of these type of duties.
In December 1904, the Japanese got close enough to Port Arthur to shell Russian warships with their land-based artillery. Ship by ship, Russia's Pacific Fleet was sent to the bottom. Days later, Port Arthur surrendered. Kolchak was among the 25,000 Russian prisoners, though as a sick and wounded officer, he was repatriated a few months later and returned to his wife in St. Petersburg.
And of course, I'll just make clear, when I'm sort of analyzing Kolchak here, I'm trying to hold, what I know of him out of my head, right? I'm trying to analyze him as a younger man here, right? Which is worth doing with these historical figures, because Kolchak didn't know how things were going to go, right? Nobody did, and people changed throughout the course of their lives. So, I'm saying ambitious? I don't know. We know where he ends up. I'm just saying we're taking a look at him, not like way earlier in his life, but a bit earlier in his life and career, right? I don't know how he changed or was different over the years.
The war had been a demoralizing affair for Russia, and for Kolchak personally, though he received several medals for his leadership and bravery.
Admiral.
(1914), the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo sparks an international crisis. Austria-Hungary accuses Serbia of responsibility for the crime and plans to retaliate. This causes Nicholas II to mobilize Russia's army to support Serbia.
Yeah, Serbia goes, "Who, us? We would never!" And of course they probably were involved in the assassination. It's unclear how exactly, but, the Serbian government, or at least people within the Serbian government, were related in some way to the Black Hand organization that was responsible for the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. And Serbia, agreed to most of Austria's demands. Not all. It was really just an attempt at gaining a casus belli for Austria. After Ferdinand gets assassinated, they pretty much want to go to war with Serbia. They give them this list of demands, but really they just want to step in and crush them. Of course, it leads to this rather rapidly escalating series of events, which, once again, it's not like, well, some people saw something like this coming, but, you couldn't really have predicted what was going to happen in any accurate way.
Slavic ally. In response, Austria's ally, Germany, declares war on Russia. Soon, all the great European empires are at war. That summer, as the Russian army blundered towards disaster in East Prussia, 39-year-old Captain Kolchak took command of a destroyer flotilla in Russia's Baltic Fleet. The previous year, he'd been described in an official report as an outstanding officer in every respect. Firm character, well-mannered, very disciplined. Kolchak was, in every way, a model Tsarist officer.
Honestly, he's in the right place at the right time. I don't know what his opinion on the war was. I imagine he was a rather patriotic Russian, if I had to guess, based on everything I know about him. 39 years old, that description. He's a good officer with firm character. You know, if you think about who could benefit from a war like this, not many people. The war was horrible for most, but this type of officer, who he's actually, at this point, he's not early in his career, he's firmly established, he's won many medals, but he's the type of guy who still has room to grow. So this is the type of person who actually could see some advancement and some benefit from a conflict like this breaking out.
Now in the Baltic, he and his flotilla would enjoy notable success, despite the overwhelming superiority of the German navy. Once more, mine warfare was the Russians' favoured tactic. In the early days of the conflict, Kolchak's flotilla alone laid 6,000 mines in the Gulf of Finland. These operations effectively shielded the Russian capital from attack by sea. Kolchak went on to direct a series of bold night operations, laying mines on the approaches to enemy ports, including Memel, Danzig, and Kiel. Kolchak's courageous leadership won him more medals, and a meeting with Emperor Nicholas himself.
Oh, wow.
In 1916, Kolchak was promoted, becoming the youngest admiral in the Russian Navy, with a new role, Commander-in-Chief of the Black Sea Fleet.
Impressive.
He arrived at his new headquarters at Sevastopol in Crimea in July.
So, like I said, this is a man who actually was set to benefit from this war, and he did, right? You know, given the sort of career track that he was on, we've seen that he was young to achieve this honor, right? Being made an admiral, being advanced through the ranks. The war might not be going well, really for anybody, to be honest, but it's going quite well for Admiral Kolchak here.
He was accompanied by his wife, Sofia, and their 6-year-old son. The couple had by now lost 2 children in infancy. Across the Black Sea, Kolchak faced Russia's old adversary, the Ottoman Empire, and Bulgaria. Kolchak quickly adopted an aggressive strategy, laying mines off the enemy's coast and providing naval support for Russian operations near the Caucasus. His great hope was to launch an operation to capture the Bosporus Strait, which would be a decisive blow against the Ottomans, and open up a sea route to Russia's western allies.
I mean, there's a reason that Constantinople has always been such an important city. Well, a couple of reasons, frankly, but the control of that sea passage is one of those reasons, right? So clearly Kolchak recognizes the importance of claiming and controlling that. And then, I mean, it's shown on the screen here, having much easier access to a trade route to the west.
Russia's first Naval Infantry Division was created for this task and placed under Kolchak's command. But the operation would never happen. It remained a dream beyond Russia's capabilities. Nevertheless, Kolchak's success in the Black Sea made him famous once more, a celebrated war hero at a time when Russians were desperate for good news.
Yeah, desperate for good news and for heroes, people to look up to, right? As the emperor himself, the Tsar, became increasingly unpopular due to his personal involvement with this war that was really hurting so many people, losing so many lives, right? People were struggling and desperate. Not to mention, you know, the emperor, Tsar Nicholas, was unpopular for a bunch of reasons. Could talk about Rasputin. But his involvement with the war was really doing him in by the end of his reign. And so the people were really desperate for heroes and role models and just people to look up to.
Because from every other quarter, the news was of defeat, chaos, and turmoil.
Revolution. Here we go.
March 1917. On the streets of Russia's capital, renamed Petrograd, there were protests against food prices and the huge sacrifices of the war. It was the start of a revolution. The news took a few days to reach the Black Sea Fleet, 1,000 miles to the south in Crimea. Admiral Kolchak, determined to prevent any unrest within his fleet, issued a proclamation. I order all officers of the Black Sea Fleet and land forces entrusted to me to continue firmly and unwaveringly to fulfill their duty to the Emperor and motherland.
So, as we see here, Kolchak is a true blue czarist, right? He is loyal. He remains loyal, right? And this is something I'm sure we'll talk about as we get into the Russian Civil War. As I mentioned earlier, the Whites, right, in opposition to the Reds, the Bolsheviks, were this very diverse group. There were a lot of different forces. Kolchak very much represents one particular faction. He was sort of the leader generally, though, once again, they were not as directly organized as the Bolsheviks were, but he particularly represented this faction of conservative, czarist, military officer types, right? He's representing very much the conservative wing of this movement. I mean, there were those more conservative than him, but you can see that here. This is something he very much holds on to. And of course, there were factions opposed to the Bolsheviks from more of a sort of a liberal perspective, or, I mean, even like anarchist factions that at times were fighting alongside the Bolsheviks, at times opposing them. It's all very complicated. When people think of the Whites, they generally think of that type of conservative, czarist military officer, which, you know, once again, was not the whole movement. That's oversimplifies it a bit. But those were the people who held a lot of the positions, who held a lot of the power, and probably were the most influential faction among the Whites. And like I said, when people thought of the Whites, this is the type of guy they thought of. Of course, Kolchak in particular, because he's going to go on to lead them, but also people like him generally. So we're just, the point is, we're sort of seeing his, and we've been seeing his sort of ideological commitments here as everything is really kicking off.
The very next day, Nicholas II abdicated the throne.
Oh.
For Kolchak, it was a bewildering blow. Duty, discipline, loyalty to sovereign and motherland were all he knew.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure Kolchak was like, okay, so the people are protesting in the streets. There are some mutinous soldiers. Who cares? You're the Tsar. Fulfill your duty to the people. I'll fulfill my duty to you. And duty to the people. No, more like duty to God. You know, duty to your country. I'm pretty sure that's how Kolchak would have phrased it. Not duty to the people. But, hey, Tsar Nicholas has abdicated.
And he foresaw chaos ahead. In contrast, most of his sailors celebrated the news of revolution in Petrograd.
Yeah. Those sailors, they were a pretty mutinous bunch, or they could be, right? If we think about... Now remember, it's not like the Bolsheviks have taken over yet. And when we talk about the 1917 revolution, there were actually two revolutions, or, you know, a couple of different revolutionary events. The Bolsheviks are not the ones in power yet. We're going to get the, I mean, everything's very much in flux. We're going to get the sort of like liberal provisional government. There were socialists in it, there were liberals in it, and then afterwards, when we get our second revolution, we will then get the Bolsheviks. But it's worth pointing out that the Bolsheviks in particular found themselves with a lot of support among the soldiers, right? Among those serving in the army and in the navy. So there were a lot of people in the army and the navy in the military who were not very sympathetic to the Tsar, which makes sense because a lot of Russians generally at this point were not super sympathetic to the Tsar, and all these soldiers were just drawn from the general population. They're no different from anybody else, but there was a high concentration of Bolshevik support among these military men. I mean, particularly in Petrograd and Moscow. But, we'll sort of see how this all develops. A lot of the officers will soon find themselves getting turned on by their own men, right?
Their life was one of grim conditions and brutal discipline. Finally, here was a chance to overturn that hated regime. In Sevastopol, sailors elected their own Soviet council and formed their own committees. Initial demand...
And what I'll say there with talking about electing your own council and your Soviet, remember, Soviet in the beginning just meant like a council, right? That's where the word Soviet comes from. Of course, now we associate it with the country of the Soviet Union and the Soviets, but initially a Soviet is just this type of council. There was a Moscow Soviet, a Petrograd Soviet. That's what we're talking about. I know I've been mentioning the Bolsheviks a lot, because the Bolsheviks will end up being important in winning all of this. The Bolsheviks were not the only socialist or communist faction or group. In fact, the Bolsheviks were one of the less popular of the communist and socialist groups. You had the social revolutionaries, you had the Mensheviks, you had a whole bunch of these other political parties and groups and factions. So, just keep that in mind.
And formed their own committees. Initial demands included renaming every ship which carried an imperial name.
Nice.
Discipline and respect for authority began to collapse. Kolchak maintained a high tempo of military operations to keep his men occupied, but privately talked of facing the disgrace of a senseless mutiny in wartime. For 3 months, he held the fleet together, with firm leadership and careful compromises with his sailors. But Bolshevik agitators were at work amongst the men. They wanted the capitalist war ended immediately, and Tsarist officers like Kolchak removed from command. In June, the crew of his own flagship, the Georgy Pobedonosets, confronted the admiral. They demanded that all officers be stripped of their sidearms and swords. To avoid bloodshed, Kolchak agreed. But rather than hand over his own ceremonial sword, he hurled it into the sea.
Talk about making a statement.
"Even the Japanese, our enemies, let me keep my weapons," he told his men. "You will not have them now."
Okay, so we see his opinion on all this. Exile. Yeah, so, and think about this. Now look, any type of mutiny is going to be dangerous if you're the officer. That is particularly true if you're on a ship. If we're talking about a naval context, right? You are trapped on there with your men. It's not great, if you're part of the army, if you're in the barracks, but you have a lot more of an ability to escape than if you're trapped on a ship. And the sort of phenomenon we see here is similar to what you saw with, say, the French Revolution, right? Where you have this revolutionary moment, and then a bunch of the revolutionaries form themselves into the National Guard and join up with the military, and a lot of the officers, the aristocrats of the old regime, are either pushed out or they leave on their own accord, or they're, even tried and suspected of treason, right? And that can really rile up and dislocate your military operations, right? France has a hard time finding its footing, and then actually finds it remarkably quickly. Napoleon, yes, but even before Napoleon, those revolutionary armies were doing remarkably well, in part due to enthusiasm and patriotism and mass mobilization. But anyway, you see a phenomenon here of the revolution has riled everybody up, and the pre-existing hierarchy can no longer be allowed to stand. Now that is not good for someone like Admiral Kolchak here, and so now we get into exile.
A few days later, Kolchak resigned his command and travelled to Petrograd. His wife and son remained in Crimea. He would not see them again.
Dang.
Kolchak had already publicly denounced the reforms of Russia's new provisional government, which he believed were destroying the military.
So, once again, keep in mind, we're just getting a sense of where Kolchak is ideologically. The provisional government is like way too much for him. Way too much. They're destroying the military. This has already gone way too far. I mean, frankly, he wanted the Tsar to stay in power. And we know that we're gonna go much further than the provisional government, right? The Bolsheviks will make the provisional government look like the most, cautious moderates of all time. And in some ways they were pretty cautious, right? Like staying in the war. That's one thing the provisional government did, is they stayed in World War I, whereas the Bolsheviks, they're going to pull out. Of course, they then get into a war of their own, the Civil War. But anyway, Kolchak is already totally opposed to whatever's happening here.
Now, the story of his defiance in the face of mutiny made headlines across Russia. Kolchak's reputation among Russian conservatives was sky high.
Yeah.
They even wondered if he might be the military dictator the country needed to restore law and order.
I mean, this is exactly the type of guy that these, conservatives who are furious at this new regime look up to, right? Kolchak is this decorated war hero. He he didn't get himself killed by the mutineers, but he sort of stood up to the mutiny. He's speaking out against the provisional government. And so, a lot of these conservatives just want to restore the Tsar. Some of them, because, even a lot of more moderate conservative types realized that the Tsar was doing a pretty bad job by the end. So some of them, either because of that, or because they've recognized things have gone too far, they're like, okay, we can't go back to what we had. We need something else. So people begin looking to someone like Kolchak. And not someone like him. They look to him. These more conservative types.
Such whispers alarmed Russia's provisional government. The new Minister of War, Alexander Kerensky, may even have seen Kolchak as a potential rival. So he met with Kolchak and informed him that he was to be sent abroad as part of a military mission to the Western Allies. In truth, it was what Kolchak himself described as a form of political exile. That summer, Kolchak sailed via Norway to Britain, then to the United States of America.
Oh wow, I didn't know that. I will say, even though he's basically been sent into foreign exile, it's interesting that they even had that conversation, him and Kerensky, even though Kolchak was not a fan of the government. It's not as if, we'll see. He much more strongly opposes the Bolsheviks, right? I'll put it that way. There was no Lenin saying, hey, Kolchak, could you maybe leave for now? They were not on that level. And that's because the provisional government, is, and the Bolsheviks really did not do this, they're trying to, they obviously recognize there's a clean break between them and the Tsarist government, but they're trying to maintain some type of continuity and political legitimacy, right? That's one of the reasons they stay in the war, because they feel like they need to hold up the promises that the Tsarist government had made, even though this is a new regime, right? As opposed to the Bolsheviks, who were just clean break, cut everything off.
He met with President Wilson and senior U.S. naval officers. But plans for meaningful military cooperation between Russia and the Allies were clearly going nowhere.
Well, yeah.
In San Francisco, Kolchak accepted an invitation to return to Russia, to enter politics as a candidate for the Cadets, Russia's last non-socialist political party.
Yeah, and this is where you get into this very flexible, in-flux political situation where, the cadets, and Russia has had this developing political culture. After the 1905 revolution, the Tsar grants them some type of representation, which he then tries to strip away. He mostly does, but there is a political culture in Russia. The cadets are this sort of like constitutional liberal party. You can think of them like that. And so, under the Tsarist regime, they were a sort of left-wing force, essentially. But at this point, given the provisional government is sort of representing them in a way, they are now a sort of centrist and quickly becoming a sort of like right-wing faction, right? Because the socialists and communists are now taking over the political scene, right? The social revolutionaries, Bolsheviks, Mensheviks. And so the cadets, you can tell from the fact that they're bringing Kolchak into this, that they've sort of shifted, or the political scene has shifted around them. But of course, they has really shifted along with it.
But in Japan, en route home, he received shocking news. There had been a second revolution in Russia.
Oh, wow.
The Bolsheviks had seized power. Lenin was now in charge.
White Russians. Oh, man.
Kolchak was appalled by the October Revolution of 1917.
I'm sure he was. He didn't like the provisional government. This is like his worst fear, and the worst fear of every conservative Russian. Now, the Bolsheviks, the most radical of these communist parties, have taken over. And the most militant, and I mean, frankly, I think the reason the Bolsheviks were able to take over and hold power is because they were the most militant of these socialist parties.
He despised Lenin and the Bolsheviks, who'd soon rename themselves the Russian Communist Party. The chief cause of his hostility was Lenin's plan to make an immediate peace with Germany.
Yep, that's that clean break.
Like many
Now, it wasn't actually clean. There was a massive sacrifice to establish peace with Germany. But this is the difference, one of the many differences between the provisional government and the Bolsheviks. The Bolsheviks promised to end the war. So did Kerensky and the provisional government, by the way. They promised to end the war. They didn't. The Bolsheviks promised to end the war, or at least get out of the war, I should say. They promised to leave the war. And they do leave the war, but it comes at a very high cost.
Officers, Kolchak regarded Russia's commitments to her World War I allies as sacred. Lenin's negotiations with the Germans were both dishonorable and treasonous. Kolchak's course of action was clear. As an admiral of the Russian fleet, I considered our allied commitment to the war against Germany to remain in full force.
Yeah, and, we'll see this as we get into the Civil War. It should be unsurprising that the Russian whites received support and backing from the Western powers, from Britain and the United States, and frankly, sometimes even more than backing. There was active intervention in this conflict from countries like the United States. Right? In part because they didn't like the fact that the Bolsheviks were trying and then did pull out of the war, right? The Entente powers rather would have kept Russia as an ally. And also, unsurprisingly, all the capitalist powers of the West were really, really opposed to the Bolsheviks. And so, once again, it's not surprising that these Western powers found an ally in the Russian whites.
The only form in which I could continue my service to the motherland, which was now in the hands of German agents and traitors, was to join the war effort against Germany on the side of our allies. Kolchak offered his services to the British. They initially planned to send him to Mesopotamia, but soon backed him for a much larger role.
Yeah.
With fighting still raging on World War I's Western Front, the Allies were desperate for Russia to rejoin the struggle against Germany.
Yep.
This meant removing Lenin and the Bolsheviks from power, who that July added to their crimes by executing Emperor Nicholas II and his entire family at Yekaterinburg.
Yeah, and so I was talking about the orientation of these Russian conservatives. I mean, first of all, they're appalled and horrified by this. This is like the most horrific thing they could imagine. And also, I was saying earlier that some Russian conservatives, some still wanted the Tsar, some were like, well, the Tsar kind of sucks, we gotta go with someone else. Well, at this point, you can't have the Tsar, because the Tsar and his family are dead. I mean, you could go for, like, a relation. I'm not sure who the closest living relation to the family was, but, you know, we've truly moved past the point of a return to the Tsarist order in a very real way, right? The Tsar and his family have been murdered, and so now you gotta turn to somebody new. Somebody like a Kolchak.
Therefore, as civil war engulfed Russia, the Allies would back the...
And I'll say, for those unfamiliar with the murder of the Tsar and his family, it's unclear to us even to today who actually ordered this, as in, we don't know if this was an order from the top, from Lenin, or a top Bolshevik official that was handed down and then was, you know, destroyed, or if this was something done in the moment by the Bolshevik guards in the area because they felt, you know, the enemy forces were closing in. And we just don't know, even to this day. We just don't have evidence to back. Well, I mean, of course, there's always some pieces of evidence, but we don't have strong evidence to prove the assertion. So we don't know truly who ordered this murder or if anyone ordered it.
Therefore, as civil war engulfed Russia, the Allies would back the anti-Bolshevik forces, known as the Whites, against the Bolsheviks, the Reds.
Mm-hmm.
The British now put forward Admiral Kolchak as a man who could unify and lead White Russian forces in the Far East, a proposal that met with widespread support. In September 1918, Kolchak arrived in Vladivostok. Here he learned that anti-Bolshevik groups had recently met in Ufa and established a new provisional all-Russian government. This was effectively a continuation of the provisional government that had been swept aside by the Bolsheviks. Therefore,
Provisional government that Kolchak hated.
it had little support from Kolchak and other conservatives,
Yep.
who blamed the provisional government for leading Russia into chaos in the first place.
So, I mean, already you can see here the complexity of the faction in that, you know, the Bolsheviks sweep in, the Whites, the opponents. Well, you have these more sort of constitutional liberal types who are like, well, let's continue the provisional government. And then you have a bunch of right-wingers and conservatives who are like, no, let's not do that. We hated that. It's your fault this all happened, is what they think.
That month, the advance of Bolshevik Red Army troops forced the provisional government to abandon Ufa and retreat to Omsk.
And, you know, and I'm sure we'll get into this throughout, you know, end of part 1 and part 2. There's always a lot of questions and wondering how and why did the Bolsheviks win this war in the end. You know, the Whites controlled all this territory. Well, the Bolsheviks controlled the industrial heartland of the country. They didn't control as much territory as the Whites, but a lot of the territory the Whites controlled wasn't really worth controlling in the first place, right? The Bolsheviks held this industrial heartland. The Bolsheviks were a pretty militant force. They had a deep sense of organization, a deep unity compared to the Whites. They had the leadership of Trotsky, right? So I think the Bolsheviks had a lot going for them that lead to them winning this conflict. Now, obviously, it was not a blowout. There's going to be years of brutal fighting between these two sides. And I think, you know, in this moment, with things kicking off, you wouldn't have known who was going to win in the end. In retrospect, we have those advantages that the Bolsheviks possessed. But we'll see how it plays out.
Kolchak traveled 2,800 miles by train to join it. On the 5th of November 1918, after much discussion, he agreed to become the Provisional Government's Minister of War and Navy. 2 days later, Kolchak formed a general staff and went to the front to assess the situation.
Civil War, here we go.
Across Russia, the military situation was incredibly complex.
Yeah.
White Russian forces were scattered on Russia's periphery. General Boldyrev commanded 180,000 provisional government troops on the Omsk front. General Denikin's volunteer army in southern Russia had around 50,000 troops. The northern Russian government, a small White Russian enclave, had just 6,000 troops. They were supported by Allied contingents of varying sizes, mostly in support and training roles. The Allies' most important contribution was sending arms, ammunition and supplies via Russia's seaports. Then there was the Czechoslovak Legion, about 50,000 strong, on the Omsk front. The Legion's story was an odd one.
I'm glad we're getting into it, because it was an odd one.
The unit, made up mostly of Czech volunteers, had been fighting alongside the Russians on the Eastern Front against the Germans. When the Bolsheviks took over and made peace with Germany, the Legion had received permission to travel by rail to Vladivostok, to then travel by sea to France, to rejoin the Allies. But the Bolsheviks then changed their mind and tried to disarm the Czechs, who fought back.
Yeah, unsurprisingly. So now this Czech Legion is basically trapped in Russia, and they're like trying to fight their way home.
The Legion was now stranded in Russia, but held key points along the Trans-Siberian Railway.
As they said, it's a very odd situation.
The crucial east-west transport and supply route. To further complicate the picture, Russia's civil war raged alongside several national wars and independence struggles.
And these are, these are a couple of different conflicts, but they're also kind of part of one big conflict. Like, yes, there are a couple of discrete conflicts, wars happening here, but then it's also just part of this one big sort of civil war, the takeover of the Bolsheviks. All of this is very much connected.
In Poland, Ukraine, Lithuania, and elsewhere. Russia's white forces, fragmented both geographically and often politically, faced the gigantic resources of Lenin's Bolshevik Russian state, controlling Russia's major cities, industrial centers and transport hubs, with around 800,000 troops under its command. It was a daunting prospect. The challenging military situation did nothing to ease political tensions among the whites.
Right.
They included at one extreme left-wing socialist revolutionaries who'd led the February Revolution. At the other extreme, right-wing conservatives who wanted to restore the monarchy.
Yeah, this is the fractious nature of the whites that I've been talking about this whole video.
This latter group had no more time for socialists and provisional governments. They believed only a strong dictator could save Russia now.
I will say, though, that this was a very fractious movement. There were lots of different factions. It was generally more right-wing oriented. It is hard to make a generalization, but like I was saying earlier, a lot of the leadership roles were filled by these more conservative types. A lot of the sort of liberals, after the defeat, basically, or the fall of the provisional government, sort of acceded to these more conservative types. You know, you still had some of these socialists who were part of it, but a lot of the socialists, you know, once the Bolsheviks took over, even if they weren't Bolsheviks, just sort of joined up with the Bolsheviks. And so, yes, I don't want to, absolutely, this was a very sort of diverse ideological movement. There were lots of different factions, but these factions were not like equally distributed in terms of manpower or just power generally. That was definitely lopsided.
On the 18th of November, they made their move. 300 Cossack troops rode into Omsk and arrested all the socialist revolutionary delegates they could find. The provisional government was abolished by its own executive, the Council of Ministers. It then moved to elect a new supreme ruler of Russia, who would wield complete dictatorial power. The man they chose was Admiral Alexander Kolchak.
There he is.
A proven leader with a brilliant military record, widely respected, in close contact with the Western Allies.
And this was perfectly fine for Kolchak, right? As we've covered, he was a hardcore czarist. Now, the czar's gone. Kolchak, he didn't like democracy, he didn't like liberalism, he definitely didn't like socialism. So a sort of military dictatorship, this is exactly the type of government he wanted. And now he gets to rule it, right? So, perfect.
Above all, he was a man who shared their vision, that only a return to law and order could save Russia from chaos. Kolchak himself had not sought the position of supreme ruler, believing others were better suited. But duty had called, and he would answer.
Okay, so that is the end of part one, Kolchak and Russia's Civil War. We basically got a good look, a good setup of Kolchak's life up to this point. Though really mainly World War I and how we get to the Civil War. We've already been dealing with the beginning phases. Now in this second part, we'll get to deal with the rest, the entirety of the very destructive Russian Civil War, and of course Kolchak's leadership in particular. So thank you everybody for watching. If you enjoyed this one, I'd appreciate it if you'd leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon, which is linked down below. Once again, thank you for tuning in. I hope you're all having a great day today, and I'll see you all again next time. Goodbye.